The fourth largest city in the United States sits on a coastal swamp, 50 miles from open water, in a hurricane zone, on ground that floods without warning and sinks a little more every year. It has no natural harbor. The nearest navigable waterway was too shallow for cargo ships when the city was founded. The nearest serious port, one with deep water, actual trade, and a seemingly bright future, was already operating 80 miles away. Every geographic argument said to build Houston somewhere else. But today, it controls more oil refining capacity than any city on Earth. 40% of all U.S. refining happens within 200 miles of its center. The largest petrochemical complex in the Western Hemisphere runs along a waterway that didn't even exist 115 years ago. How does that happen on a swamp? In 1836, two brothers from New York, named Augustus and John Allen, bought 6,642 acres of swampy coastal prairie along Buffalo Bayou and named their new town after the hero of the Battle of San Jacinto. Their sales pitch called it the Great Interior Commercial Emporium of Texas. Buffalo Bayou was shallow and choked with vegetation. The land flooded regularly. The heat was brutal. Disease was common. 80 miles southeast on Galveston Island sat a real natural harbor. Deep water, direct Gulf access, a port already moving Texas cotton and cattle. Galveston was the obvious city. Houston was a real estate brochure. For decades, that was accurate. Galveston grew into the largest city in Texas and one of the busiest ports in the United States. Houston sat inland with a muddy waterway and oversold land. Then, on September 8, 1900, a hurricane hit Galveston. It killed somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 people, the deadliest natural disaster in American history. The storm surge covered the entire island. The city that was supposed to be the commercial capital of the Gulf Coast was gone in a night. Galveston rebuilt. It raised the grade of the entire island and constructed a seawall. But the geography that made it vulnerable hadn't changed. It sat on a barrier island fully exposed. No amount of engineering was going to make it a safe home for the industrial-scale port that Texas needed. Houston saw the opening immediately. In 1910, Congress authorized dredging a deep water channel from Houston to Galveston Bay. Work crews spent 4 years cutting 50 miles of waterway through the bayou, wetland, and tidal flat. When the Houston Ship Channel opened in 1914, President Woodrow Wilson fired a ceremonial cannon from Washington by telegraph. Houston had built a port from scratch on land that had none. That is not a geographic advantage, that's a geographic override. The city deciding the site was wrong and correcting it with federal money and dredging equipment. The timing was incredibly fortunate. 13 years earlier, on January 10, 1901, a drilling crew at a salt dome called Spindletop, outside Beaumont, Texas, about 100 miles from Houston, struck oil. The gusher blew 100,000 barrels a day for 9 days before they capped it. American oil production doubled within a year. It was the largest oil strike in U.S. history at the time. No other Gulf Coast city had that combination of oil production and new deepwater access. Refineries moved to the ship channel almost immediately. The land along the channel was flat and cheap. The water was deep enough for tankers. The fields were close. Pipelines followed the refineries. Petrochemical plants followed the pipelines. Storage terminals and distribution infrastructure filled every gap in between. Each piece of new infrastructure made the next investment more rational. Within 2 decades, the Houston Ship Channel had become the most industrially concentrated waterway in the Western Hemisphere, a title it still holds. The channel today handles over 247 million tons of cargo per year. It's the busiest port in the United States by foreign tonnage. A third of the country's petrochemical capacity lines its banks. Refineries, tank farms, chemical plants, along 50 miles of waterway. that a map from 1900 would not show at all. Houston didn't find an energy economy, it assembled one, piece by piece, starting with a dredged ditch and a well-timed oil strike, at exactly the moment the American industrial age needed somewhere to put it. But Houston is sinking. Not metaphorically, the city is physically subsiding, the ground compressing as groundwater is pulled from the clay-heavy sediments below. In parts of Harris County, the surface has dropped by 10 feet over the last century. In some industrial areas along the ship channel, the ground now sits below sea level. The geology that made the site look wrong in 1836 is still there. Houston sits on soft, compressible sediment, the same waterlogged ground the Allen brothers chose. Extract water from it and it compresses. It doesn't recover. Houston also has no zoning code. It's the largest city in the United States without one, a decision voters have affirmed repeatedly. The city grew fast and spread wide, paving over the coastal prairie and wetlands that once absorbed rainfall across Harris County. Wetland absorbs water. Concrete doesn't. On August 25, 2017, Hurricane Harvey made landfall southwest of the city and stalled. For 4 days it rained. Some parts of Houston received 60 inches, the highest rainfall total ever recorded from a single storm in U.S. history. The flooding caused $125 billion in damage and destroyed or damaged more than 200,000 homes. It was the costliest tropical storm in American history. The storm was extreme, but 60 inches of rain drains differently on a permeable prairie than on a city that replaced the prairie with asphalt and concrete. Houston's drainage infrastructure was designed around historical storm patterns, not the storms the Gulf now produces. The flat land, the clay soil, the bayous with nowhere to go, the same geographic facts the Allen brothers overlooked in 1836 were still fully in place in 2017, just buried under 100 years of development. When Harvey shut down the ship channel, gasoline prices rose across the eastern United States within days. Refineries processing nearly a third of the country's fuel went offline. Chemical plants that supply manufacturers across North America stopped running. The country felt it at the pump within 72 hours. The pipelines running out of Houston carry fuel to Atlanta, Chicago, and the East Coast. None of it can be moved. You can't relocate 50 miles of refinery infrastructure. You can't replicate a century of expertise in a city that doesn't have the port, the pipelines, or the workforce. The investment in Houston is so deep and so interconnected that the geography underneath it barely registers in the economic calculation, until it floods. Houston isn't the energy capital of America because it was the right place to build one. It got there because it built one anyway, on a swamp, without a harbor, before the oil was even found, and then spent 100 years making that decision impossible to reverse. Go back to that original swamp. 2 brothers from New York, 6,642 acres of coastal prairie, a real estate pitch that overpromised by about a century. The geography said, wrong site, wrong waterway, wrong future. Galveston is 80 miles east, build there. Houston built here instead, dredged a port, caught the oil, assembled the infrastructure before anyone fully understood what they were building. And now, the city that geography said shouldn't be there is the city that keeps the American energy economy running. The ground is still sinking. The storms are getting stronger. Harvey cost $125 billion, and the next one is already forming somewhere in the Gulf. Houston has been winning the argument with its own geography for 100 years. The question isn't whether the geography can be beaten. Houston already answered that. The question is whether the winning margin is as wide as it used to be. If you want to see what happens when a different part of Texas runs out of something it can't engineer its way around, the Texas water video covers that. I'll link it above. The world has a structure. Let's keep finding it.